The Minneapolis City Council has voted to dismantle and defund the city's police department following the brutal killing of George Floyd. The council has also recommended that the city adopt a community policing model despite strong opposition from the mayor himself. 9 members of the Minneapolis City Council announced that they intend to end the city's policing in its current form and rebuild a new model for public safety. With 9 votes, the council, which enjoys veto-proof supermajority, made its announcement as protests stretched into its 13th day across the United States.
Our commitment is to do what's necessary to keep every single member of our community safe and to tell the truth that the Minneapolis police are not doing that. Our commitment is to end our city's toxic relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department, to end policing as we know it, and to recreate systems of public safety that actually keep us safe.
Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, who stood in opposition to the idea of dismantling the police department, was heckled by a huge crowd of protesters. The protesters had marched to the mayor's residence demanding the removal of funding for the Minneapolis Police Department.
If you're asking whether I'm willing to do everything I possibly can throughout the rest of my term to make sure that the police union, the police contract, the arbitration system, and some of these policies that have resulted in problems specifically for black and brown people, and murder, by the way, over a series of generations, I'm all for that. I'm not for abolishing the entire police department, and I'll be honest about that too.
Now, for more on this, we are being joined by Simon Marks live from Washington, D.C. Good evening, and thanks for being with us. Minneapolis City Council has voted to dismantle and defund the city's police department and now adopt a community policing model. Take us through the significance of this.
Well, I mean, I suppose the most significant thing in terms of the politics locally in Minneapolis is that vote by the city council is veto-proof. So there is no possible way that the mayor of the city or the governor of Minnesota can move in and undo what the city council has decided to move forward with. But the question is, what exactly have they decided to move forward with? It looks as though the city is going to be in for weeks, if not months, of discussion and debate about what you do if you don't have a police force. There are some activists that are arguing, for example, that in some cases when people would traditionally pick up the phone and call the police, mental health professionals might be sent out as a response. In other cases, perhaps some kind of community security operation would swing into action. But this issue of defund the police, that 3-word slogan that is now being so widely used, not just in Minneapolis, but all over the United States, opens up an entirely new avenue of debate here. Yes, you can take funding away from the police force, and in the case of the City Council in Minneapolis, they reached the conclusion not only that all attempts to reform the police force had failed, but that in fact the police force in that particular city was irredeemable, unreformable, they said. So you can absolutely make the decision to do away with the police, but what you're going to put in their place, that's going to be the big issue of debate in Minneapolis and all over the country over the next few months.
Absolutely. Simon, stay with us while we go through our next report for more on this. The protests demanding justice for George Floyd and racial equality have intensified across several states in the U.S. as the protest entered its 13th day. Peaceful and large-scale demonstrations were seen in the cities of Washington, New York, Minneapolis, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Now, in the country's capital, thousands turned out for the protests, defying all social distancing rules. However, unlike earlier scenes of clashes and vandalism, the protests on the 13th day were peaceful, and the newly erected fence around the White House was also decorated with political messages and slogans demanding racial justice in the United States. Celebrities from Hollywood have also spoken out against increasing racial inequality in the U.S. Several actors have also called for complete reform in police departments in order to ensure that there are no cases of brutality anymore. In Washington, D.C., Bob Marley's daughter, Makeda Marley, joined Black Lives Matter protests and hit out at Donald Trump for his anti-racial remarks and stance. An African-American couple made an important political statement by tying the knot and celebrating their wedding at a Black Lives Matter protest. And just moments after getting married, the newlywed couple joined the protests in Philadelphia and held their hands together as demonstrators wished them a happy life ahead. Demonstrations were also planned demanding justice for George Floyd in Denver, Los Angeles, and other small towns across eastern Texas. The protesters demanded immediate reforms in police departments and also called for a broader movement seeking racial equality. In New York City, hundreds of protesters took to the streets in Manhattan for a protest organized by Black Lives Matter. And the rally happened as the city's mayor eased restrictions and also removed the curfew that was imposed to stop the violence. The demonstrators held placards demanding justice for Floyd and his family and condemned the political inaction by the Trump administration.
My faith tradition.
Now back to you, Simon. Taking a look at the protests across the states, it's day 13 of the protests. And today, they are mostly peaceful. Take us through some of these protests calling for justice for George Floyd.
Yes, I mean, I think we're at a turning point in a couple of different ways. First of all, the size of the protests that we witnessed over the weekend is a very clear indication that this is now about George Floyd, but it's about much more than George Floyd. And particularly here in Washington, D.C., with the White House essentially now a fortress surrounded by this security perimeter that has moved further into the city than simply the fence surrounding the building. There is a clear indication here that at some level these protests are now going to continue day in, day out, at least for the foreseeable future. And that's going to become a big issue for President Trump, who spent the weekend essentially besieged in the building. We didn't see him. He didn't leave the White House at all over the weekend. There is some suggestion now from White House officials that he is thinking about making some sort of speech later in the week on the subject of race relations. I mean, the other issue that is apparent is that remembering George Floyd is not going to stop anytime soon. Vice President Joe Biden, former Vice President Joe Biden, now we can say definitively the Democrats' candidate in this November's presidential election, will be meeting with members of the Floyd family within the next few hours. Later this week, we're going to see George Floyd's funeral taking place down in Texas. He was born in Houston. That's where the funeral will occur. And again, all of those moments and moments that lie in the future are going to serve essentially as rallying points for protesters and demonstrators, buoyed not just by the size of the protests that we witnessed over the weekend, but also at sort of cultural moves that have taken place here over the last few days. For example, the National Football League bowing to pressure from some of its top stars and acknowledging that Black Lives Matter and that players within the National Football League have a right to speak out without the fear of retribution by the team's owners or managers. That's a big cultural moment here in the United States, and for the President of the United States, a big challenge. Donald Trump's approval rating in a new poll today down to just 38%. Joe Biden has opened up a 15 or 16 percentage lead over Donald Trump in the national head-to-head polling that's taking place here. 5 months to go before America's presidential election. Anything can happen, but Donald Trump has now got an enormous task on his hands.
All right, Simon, and stay with us as we go into further elements of the story. America's leading newspaper, the New York Times, has come under fire after it published an opinion piece recently that urged for the use of military against Black Lives Matter protesters across the country. Following the intense backlash over the article, the New York Times opinion page editor James Bennett has now stepped down for greenlighting the controversial article written by U.S. Senator Tom Cotton. Now, Senator Cotton's article titled "Send in the Troops" was interpreted as a war cry by people across the country. Even staffers at the New York Times were not impressed by that decision. Some of them, including Pulitzer-winning writer Nicole Hannah-Jones, openly broke ranks with the paper on Twitter. Now, in the controversial piece, Senator Cotton argued that the Insurrection Act could be invoked to send the U.S. military to crush the anti-racism protests. Despite the backlash, the New York Times initially decided to stand by its editorial call. Bennett argued that it was important to discuss influential ideas rather than letting them go unchallenged. But the paper soon reversed its stance, saying that the article did not meet its editorial standards. Now, Bennett admitted that he hadn't even read the article before it was published. Donald Trump, who has had a lifelong feud with the New York Times, immediately weighed in on the issue. He called Senator Cotton's article excellent and rounded off his tweet in typical style by calling the New York Times the fake New York Times. And Simon, back to you. In light of the Black Lives Matter protests, the New York Times publishes this article, Send in the Troops. James Bennett has stepped down for green-lighting it, and now he has actually admitted that he hadn't even read the article before allowing it to be published.
Yeah, I mean, that seems absolutely extraordinary. The idea that you are the editor of the opinion page of the New York Times and you publish an editorial that is clearly going to be inflammatory as far as some of your readers and your own staff members are concerned, and you didn't read it prior to publication but left it to staff at a lower level, that seems utterly extraordinary. But more broadly, you know, this raises all sorts of questions about tolerance of different opinions and different viewpoints in the United States. You know, the Wall Street Journal on its editorial pages is a slavishly conservative newspaper. The New York Times generally a slavishly liberal newspaper, but both have always published opinions and viewpoints from the other side so that their readers get an opportunity to see what the other side is thinking. In this case, the editorial was written by an elected senator, Tom Cotton, so someone who's been sent to Congress by his constituents. And the idea that there should be essentially a gag placed on him and that he's no longer able to write this kind of an article in the opinion pages of the New York Times, I think again shows you just how seismic a cultural shift is taking place in this country. As you said, it plays right into the hands, of course, of President Donald Trump, who argues that the New York Times, a Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper staffed by an enormous number of courageous journalists, is a fake news organ. But it's a terribly complicated issue for the New York Times to have handled over the last few days, and I think that there will be competing opinions for months to come about whether they've done the right thing.
And considering all that is happening in the U.S. at the moment, it is a crucial time in the country facing anti-racism protests and riots. And at this time, as you've referenced, President Trump calling this article excellent. What do we make of this?
Well, President Trump would call it excellent because we know now not only that he favoured the use of the military on streets of towns and cities all over the country, exactly as Senator Cotton was advocating, but that actually there was something of a contentious standoff between the president on the one hand and his Defence Secretary Mark Esper and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, on the other hand, almost exactly a week ago. The president demanding that thousands of troops be deployed on America's streets, and his Pentagon chiefs saying no. And it was that no from Mark Esper that essentially opened the floodgates for a whole variety of other former leading figures. Former Defence Secretary Jim Mattis, over the weekend the former Secretary of State Colin Powell, all coming out and saying that Donald Trump is a threat to the US Constitution. It's a quiet day here today. There are small-scale protests taking place down at the White House, but there is definitely a sense that this is a lull as opposed to it being the end of the storm here.
Simon, thank you very much for joining us. That is Simon Marks bringing us all the latest from Washington, D.C.